Hello everyone. Good evening. Today we have with us P Sainath sir. He's a renowned journalist and today he is with us to talk about the human cost of India's response to COVID-19. We are honored to have you sir. Thank you so much for being here. Over to you sir.
Thank you. I'm delighted to join the SFI organized meeting today. Just let's look at where we are. I don't know how many days into the lockdown it is now, maybe 150 almost. Um, and let's look at what the international agencies are telling us about the world and where we are in India. The ILO tells us that 1.6 billion, the International Labour Organization, sorry, tells us that 1.6 billion of 3.3 billion workers in the world are out of work. There's been a 60% in decline in income across the globe, with the decline for rural communities far greater. Um, the United Nations organization, the UN itself, tells us that half the world's population is struggling with hunger. In fact, the Secretary General Guterres, in his Mandela Memorial speech, used language that you would never have seen before from a UN Secretary General, talking about the oncoming famine, talking about an incredible situation. The UNICEF tells us that by this year end, the United Nations Children's and Education Fund, whatever, the UNICEF tells us that by this year end, um, 6,000 children will die every day by the year end. The Food and Agriculture Organization tells us that 1 trillion, oh, no, I mean, we'll come to the FAO when we come to the agriculture part of it. Yeah. But it does tell us, the FAO did tell us long before the pandemic, there's $1 trillion worth of wasted food every year. That is one third of all that is produced. I think the last point of the FAO leads us to enter this discussion in some ways. What COVID 19 has done, what the pandemic has done, it did not create this economic crisis. It did not create the hunger crisis. It did not create the vulnerability of children crisis. It did not create the hunger crisis. What it does is to exacerbate all these crises enormously manifold, but more importantly, what it does, it's given us an incredible autopsy of who we are as a society, particularly in India, but I guess all around the world in every society. It's given us a eye-popping autopsy of neoliberalism and of capitalism itself. It shows us what was happening already, but we could turn away on some excuse, on some count, on some numbers, and say that doesn't have anything to do with the global economic system. It doesn't have to do with capitalism. It's about corruption in these third world countries. It's about lack of integrity. It's about incompetence. This time, the autopsy is of neoliberal capitalism, and you can't look away. Though in India we are still managing to do that, you can't, if you're a decent human being, you can't look away from the table. You have to look at the corpse on the table, and you see every nerve, sinew, vein, artery, bone, and organ on painful display. All those processes and problems that were already happening, you're now looking at it. You're now looking at what many of us were shouting at for years about the greatest problem on earth being that of rapid development of inequality. Let's take two areas, okay? Let's look at agriculture just straight away, immediately in India, and then come back to the issue of inequality. Why look at agriculture? Because if you look at your newspapers and your TV channels and panel discussions of the last 2, 3 weeks, the people who were telling you that the economy was doing brilliantly, the very people who were telling you that we were on the right, that really the Indian growth experience has proved the wisdom of living in the framework of the market rather than its stupid centralized planning and socialistic nonsense. Now they're not able to tell you that. What they do tell you is what they are telling you now. If you look at the last few editorials in the major newspapers and all the discussions you heard on television, agriculture gives us the one ray of hope. That's one editorial in a major newspaper. It's the one bright spot. From the Times of India to the Indian Express, they're all telling you this. Because it's showing a growth, it's showing some growth in a period when sector after sector is tanking miserably. Yeah. But agriculture has shown some growth. So, wow, here we are. It's agriculture that we've been undermining for 30 years, which is supposed to now give us a ray of hope. How serious is that ray of hope? And if the growth numbers, if anything, the pandemic has told you, and the autopsy tells you, that the entire notion of GDP growth, as an indicator of well-being, of human well-being, is nonsense. So is the reading of the stock market figures. By the way, the stock market has recovered in the US, and sector after sector is doing quite well. They've compared them to where they were in April. Now they're being forced to tell you, hey, the stock market doesn't really reflect the real economy. But anyway, come back to Indian agriculture. We're doing great. Now, just someone try telling the farmers that. Try telling the farm laborer that. Look, you've had one very decent, very good monsoon. You had a good rabi crop. And you had a good rabi harvest, though quite a bit of it suffered because of the lockdown. It came in the last stages. Second, you have an excellent monsoon which gives you, allows you to enter the Kharif season with some hope. Yeah, but you're not looking at what has happened to that Rabi harvest, what kind of money and income is coming, why suddenly there was a greater numbers and hope from agriculture in the villages. Many other things happened, which are not going to repeat themselves for you. Between March end and May end, or June, mid-June, We saw the biggest movement of human beings, not since partition, not since 50, 60 years, but probably in recorded human history. Much of that consists of people going back to their home villages, not just from the cities, but from other towns, other districts, other villages, because migrants are many, and the media have no understanding who a migrant is. They think a migrant laborer is someone who came out of a village in Odisha, went to a city in Mumbai or Chennai or Kolkata or somewhere else. There are many kinds of migrants. We can discuss that if you like. But the fact is that over 20 million of these, maybe twice that number, moved towards their home villages. Yeah. So you have, in fact, for that period, you have actually a tremendous offtake on the NREGS for a while. Yeah. You have people coming back and seeking livelihoods that we destroyed in the last 30 years with our planning. We kept asking, why are they leaving the cities and going? Please read the media of that time. We never asked the question, why did they leave their villages and come to the cities in the first place? They left their villages and came to the cities because of what we call the agrarian crisis. That agrarian crisis was completely policy driven. In fact, we made it a virtue, saying we have to, reduce the number of people in agriculture. There's too many people in agriculture. That's bad. We need people to come to the cities. We need to get out. Mr. Chandrababu Naidu made this famous in year 2000 when the multinational company McKinsey, when the McKinsey Associates produced a report for him called Vision 2020, which in the first chapter, perhaps in the first page or two, spoke of the need to take 40% of the population off agriculture. Where they would go, what jobs you would produce for them. Not a single job did industry, decent work, in terms of decent work. How many jobs did people do the survivors of the Mandya farmers' suicides find employment in Infosys in Bengaluru, 55 minutes drive away? Oh, yes, they do. As menial laborers, as service people in the canteen, as the guy who brings you your chai in the office. Yeah. But not into that kind of decent work, not into a step up above what they were doing. So you had the agrarian crisis, which all of us have discussed endlessly and which has gone far beyond the agrarian, led to more than 330,000 farmers' suicides in India. And that's a completely gross underestimate of a number. But the latest NCRB report brings it in official terms to about 330,000, 330,000. And all allied occupations of farming also collapsed. The weaver, the tailor, the potter, the craftsmen, the artisans, all those also entered a kind of terminal decline. And so you had millions of people leaving the cities, leaving the villages in search of jobs, going to the cities and towns in search of jobs that were not there. How do we know that there were millions of people going? We seem to be learning it only when they are leaving, that they were going, that they came here in the first place. We didn't show me a single television program, a single editorial by a lead editorial by a major newspaper that spoke of worrying migrations in the 90s and the decade of 2000 to 2010. They didn't. Suddenly, the people here got up and went back, and that's how we knew they existed. The census of India, 2011, shows you that the period 2001 to 2010 had your greatest migrations outwards in history. Yeah. The census 1991 to 2011 shows you that the population of full time farmers in your country between 91 and 2011 census, population of full time farmers in your country fell by 15 million. Who's a full time farmer? It's anyone operating a piece of land, not defined in size, but I'm talking about a census definition. Not necessarily owning the land, not necessarily male. The census definition is pretty broad and generous. It does not exclude women from being farmers, which we do as a society, not legally. Uh, it's and the definition, and it was based around someone cultivating that plot or supervising cultivation of that plot for a minimum of 180 days in a year or more, but a minimum of 180. That means 6 months. When you've been doing it 6 months, it means that your primary source of income comes from there, that you are primarily dependent on cultivation for your income. Yeah. That farmer, 180 days a year, she or he, the population fell by 15 million, which means that in those 20 years, 91 to 2011, you lost you lost full status farmers at the rate of 2,000 per day. You do the math. 15 million divided by 20 comes to 2040 or 2038 or something like that. Here was this gigantic thing happening. Yeah, but the media never noticed it until they decided to go back. Now, when they go back, of course, it meant an increase in area under cultivation because they needed to live. Of course, it meant a greater agricultural output also greater involvement in agriculture because there was a good monsoon and people could take on some work in the field. Yeah, there was a very decent monsoon. Now, what happens when you've got the output? You've got the output of the rabi crop before it started coming out, before these people went back. Now, let's look at the numbers. So, we are doing so fabulously. How come? Even as you and I discuss, tens of thousands in dairy farmers in Maharashtra, have been on the streets every week for the last 4 weeks protesting against the looting of their income by anyone you care to name. Guys, when the pandemic began, I live in Mumbai. I'm talking to you from Mumbai. When the pandemic began, in my household, we buy milk at the cost of 48 rupees to 60 rupees a liter, depending on cow milk or buffalo milk, fat content, all of that. The price of milk today, 4 months into the pandemic and lockdown, the price of milk today is still 48 rupees to 60 rupees per liter. If anything, it's gone up a couple of rupees in each category, but it has not fallen. Okay? Before the pandemic began, out of that 50 to 60 rupees per liter, the dairy farmer, got 30 rupees. Today, while the prices are still 48 to 60 rupees a liter, the dairy farmer is getting 17 rupees. So agriculture is doing brilliantly, but the farmer's income has collapsed by 50%. And that's dairy farmers. Now let's look at those crops which did brilliantly. Cotton, sugarcane. I'll take Maharashtra as the example because it is amongst the top producers of both. Now, what has happened with the Kharif crop, with the Rabi crop, is that millions of tons, taking numbers without a context, 4% growth, excellent, ray of hope. What are you going to do with that crop that you have? Whether it is the Cotton Federation of India or the sugar mills guys or the sugarcane producers associations, both of them will tell you, will be very glad to communicate to you that we are sitting on millions of pounds of unsold cotton. If you visit any of the households in Marathwada or Vidarbha, you're going to find the cotton farmer's household with 3 rooms filled to the roof with cotton. Not just the go down room that he has, but maybe in his or her actual home as well. You'll find cotton to the roof. Millions of tons of sugarcane unsold or taken up by the factories, but no one has stepped in to buy that. Now, the state government, to be fair, bought as much as they could. They bought record quantities. They bought record quantities of cotton and cane. And still, there are some 30 to 40 lakh quintals of cotton lying with the farmer. Still, millions of, pounds or lakhs of millions of tons of sugar cane as well lying unsold. And that is the Rabi crop, number one. Second, many farmers of other cash crops like watermelons, etc., their Rabi crop was simply destroyed. They had great production, yeah, but they couldn't get the labor to harvest it because the lockdown had come. It rotted in the fields, or they could not get transport to the market, and they certainly could not get a price. Now look at this. 30, 40 years of conditioning, of IMF, World Bank training that third world countries should make their farmers go for cash crop, not for food crop. Cash crop brings you hard currency dollars, and that is how you're going to eradicate poverty. That's how you're going to eradicate poverty, right? With hard currency. And meanwhile, food you could buy from the West cheap. It was very cheap in the year 2000, 2001 when they were talking about it. So this is one set of issues. Now, with all this incredible amount of cash crop lying piled up, please place the context. Globally, as I read out at the very beginning, globally there is a huge decline in income. 60% flat across the spectrum and much higher in poorer sections and rural sections. Globally, there is a gigantic fall in consumption. Who the heck is going to buy your sugarcane? Who the heck is going to buy your cotton? By the way, last year's India's cotton, we did very well, and we exported huge amounts of cotton, 50% of that to China. Good luck with trying to do that again this year. You know the state of relations between the two countries just now. But more than 50% or more of our cotton exports went to China last year. Now, with all these huge surpluses piled up, millions of farmers have repeated the same crop in the Kharif. By November, December, we are going to have more cotton, more sugarcane, more other cash crops than we ever dreamed of. And governments are encouraging people to do this. The Telangana government is encouraging people to grow BT cotton. In Punjab, people are giving up paddy, saying it's a water guzzling crop and going for BT cotton. The same is happening in Haryana. you're going to end up with gigantic quantities of stuff that you have no hope of selling. That's why from the 25th of March, I have been begging that every farmer should shift to food crop, not least for the food security of his or her family. Right now, we don't know how bad things are. I mean, yet for them. Please know that 75% of Indian farmers, I'm sure a bunch of SFI people know this already, 75% of Indian farmers are still net purchasers of food grain on the market. They don't produce enough food for themselves. And many of them are in those into cash crops, use every available inch of land to produce cash crop. So we've got another problem coming. The Kharif repeats what happened in Rabi in terms of the same crops having extraordinary levels of output, but with a global consumption in income and a global consumption in and a global fall in income and a global fall in consumption as well. So that's a very, very scary thing. Meanwhile, look at the logic of this country's thinking, of our elites thinking or our rulers thinking. We have 100 million tons of food grain piled up in what are called surplus stocks. According to me, that's a wrong word to use, but okay, call them buffer stocks or whatever you want. You've got 100 million tons of those stocks, and consider the fact that Indians have never been hungrier in their independent history. There's a gigantic fall in consumption. Worldwide, the United Nations Secretary General is telling you half this world's population is battling with hunger. One of the reasons more than 2 crore, more than 20 or double that number million of Indians went back to their villages was precisely and correctly judging that they were going to be facing a gigantic food crisis earlier rather than later if they remained in the cities. Because who the hell gave a damn about them? But in a sense, they were postponing the problem, which will now come in their thing. Third, many of them will move back to the towns and cities because we spent 30 years destroying all those livelihoods in the countryside. They're not going to come alive and stay there for you. So as I speak to you, every day, bus loads, jeep loads of people are entering Maharashtra again, including from Bengal, seeking work. Because where are the options? You destroyed, the McKinsey Vision 2020 report became a model for all states. Get 40% of people out of agriculture. You did. You did that. Meaning you got a significant number of people, you ended their livelihoods. In that sense, you got them off the land. Now you don't know what to do with them. In the cities, the public sector has seen a gutting of some 2 million jobs since the 91 economic reforms, maybe more. Millions of other vacancies are frozen, not given. From school teacher positions to public sector jobs in grade 4, class 4 and class 3, they haven't been filled up at all. Yeah. And you've seen wave after wave of retrenchments and closures across the country. Yeah. The Center for Monitoring Indian Economy told you that 122 million jobs were lost in the month of April. Some of that is on paper recovered. Now, here is your agriculture position. What are you going to do to be able to sell or consume cotton and sugarcane in the quantities that we are producing? What about that 100 million tons of food grain we have? The government of India has simply not distributed that food grain despite being aware that people are hungrier than ever before. In fact, the only thing that the cabinet did in around April 20th regarding food grain, yeah, sure, 5 kgs distribution. Please calculate how much 5 kgs lasts an Indian family of 4 or 5. Calculate how much 5 kg of food grain lasts, especially families engaged in labor, in hard work. How long does 5 kilograms last 4 people to 5 people per household? But on around April 19th, 20th, the cabinet, Union Cabinet, authorized, gave permission for the conversion of any number of tons of rice into ethanol to produce hand sanitizer. To produce hand sanitizer. You're going to destroy food to produce hand sanitizer. It gives you an idea of the mindset, the class mindset and caste mindset of the kind of people taking decisions in this country. You're going to destroy food grain that you are going to desperately need. Why are they not distributing that grain? And what will end up happening to that grain? Well, you are far above your storage capacities, incredibly above it. Ultimately, you will end up exporting a lot of that grain, as you did during the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government. The Bihari Vajpayee government exported millions of tons of grain at a rate cheaper than that which it was available to poor people in our own country. Now you can ask, who would buy that quality of grain? Who in Europe or US would buy that eat that quality of grain? Well, the answer, guys, is that it was exported to provide cattle feed, making the European cow the most food secure creature on the planet. You're going to see a repeat of that. And by the way, you're going to see millions of tons destroyed in the rains in the monsoon period, because we are way above storage capacity. And a lot of that grain is lying in the open in gunny sacks. And maybe with some ridiculous canvas covers over there, as if that's going to prevent a heavy downpour from affecting the grain. So you have a place where a nation has 100 million tons of food grain and the largest proportion of hungry people in the world. It has a law on food security, but which excludes a third of the population almost. It has a coming price crash. It's already seen a price crash, but it has a coming gigantic price crash for major cash crops, which is why I kept begging, please switch to food crop. The Indian farmer is going to be now in a very difficult situation. So that's the agriculture situation. We got great numbers. Just look at what. And so one of the things, or two of the things that COVID-19 and the pandemic does, or should do for you, is to completely rubbish the old way, the market economist way of understanding GDP growth. What is it? It's an aggregation of economic activity. It is not about well-being. As Edward Abbey, the American ecologist, once said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. The cancer cell keeps growing 20% this year, 40% next year, and if it grows more than that, you're dead. Right? So you are seeing today, COVID is showing you the complete disconnect between elite and ruling class measurements of well-being and the actual state of the people. That's something else you need to look at. Let's look at, for SFI's sake, education. There is a gigantic rush towards education now. online education. I don't know if how many of you have seen social consumption indicators of social consumption in education in India. The most recent National Sample Survey Organization on education, June 2018. It shows you and I, we are having this discussion now on StreamYard or Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Meeting or whatever. We assume or don't even question that everybody else is also having this kind of access. Do you know the incredible shutting out that is taking place, the unbelievable shutting out that is taking place of people in this, of poor children from education in this rush to online education? We always had a digital divide, right? The world had it, India had it very badly. We are now moving from digital divide to digital partition. Okay? A complete shutting out, a boundary drawn, an iron wall, or a barbed wire fence between poor children and rich. In People's Archive of Rural India, which I created and edit, the website, and which, by the way, publishes in 13 languages, including Bengali. Please look it up. You will find a story we did on Adivasi children in the large district of Palghar and Thane in that side of Maharashtra. How many of them actually have a smartphone? How many children, Adivasi or otherwise, below the age of 15, have a smartphone on which they can download and access their PDF lessons? How many girls below the age of 14 have or will maybe ever in their lives own a smartphone from those communities? It was just impossible to find a girl who owned one. They would be they would be uh, they would be dependent on their older brother, 17 years old, working in a nearby brick kiln, to come home and lend his smartphone once or twice a week for them to do their study. Yeah. While children in Mumbai, average middle class children, have internet and round the clock broadband and now fiber optic reception of the net, of connectivity. Yeah, imagine what's happening to those children. Let me give you a few numbers from the 2018 survey. That's not just a PARI study of Palghar, it's for the whole country. Karnataka, the mother of India's Silicon Valley, Bengaluru, right? And in the Indian middle classes are extremely boastful that even the Californian Silicon Valley, it's all us. We are the guys who run it. Without us, nothing would happen. Yeah. So, how many families, how many households in rural Karnataka have a computer? Any computer? 2%. 2% of Karnataka's rural population have households have computers. How many percent of those rural households have access to the internet? 8.5%. And by the way, Bengaluru is not 100% or anything, it's about 21, 22%. The best by far in the country, out the best dispersal and connectivity is in the state of Kerala. And I don't need to explain to you, this audience, why that is so. But even Kerala is being very cautious about converting to full-time online education. They're very cautious about that. They understand, for among other things, that TV has a great reach, and maybe we should be doing something there. Maybe there should be a state level education TV program set up, because more children have access to TV than to television learning than to uh, smartphone learning. By the way, when I said Karnataka, 2% households have 2% of Karnataka rural households have computers. That's less than half of Uttar Pradesh, which claims 4%. Now, what there's another table within the same study which shows you how many people actually used the net in the 30 days preceding the survey. Those figures are even lower. If access is 8%, those who used in the last 30 days, something like 6%, 5%. By the way, the reason why more people have some kind of access to the net or in Uttar Pradesh is because of migrants. The migrant laborers need those phones. They need some phone, and they need to have access as more and more public services go digital, without caring about whether poor people are able to access them or not. So now you have a situation where the commercialization and private monopolies over education are going to double and triple their control in these last few months. On Unacademy, Baiju, they have expanded their value on the market stupendously. Baiju, in the last 12 months, went from $5.5 billion value to 10.5 billion by June this year. Most of that growth has come in the months of the pandemic. What about all those children in rural Bengal whose picture is incredibly dismal? What about all those children in rural Bengal or even in poorer parts of Kolkata? How are they going to access your online education? What chances do they have? You'll also find even having a smartphone does not mean you're going to get that education free, even if the government declares it to be free government education, because you're going to have to double the package that you have. Right now, 200 rupees, 2 GB a day, etc. But that older brother of that girl is also using much of that download. They're going to have to take costlier packages. Where is the money for that when there's no income, no employment, no work, no job, and older brother is also sitting at home because the brick kiln isn't functioning? So education, you've come to that situation. Agriculture, education. Which health, you're seeing the most naked racketeering, the most rapacious loot of poor people. I said on March 26th, perhaps a lot more people are going to die of non-COVID diseases than of COVID-19, because of people who die on the long march home in dehydration, hunger, etc., but more because of people who die of other diseases who are unable to access help, since we have concentrated all our resources on COVID-19. And we never bothered to build a national health system, which the 1946 Boer Commission strongly advised India to do. You know, it really wanted India to have the kind of NHS that was unfolding in Britain, with the same NHS that saved the life of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but never stopped him from Thatcher downwards destroying that in favor of the private sector. In India, you have one of the most privatized health systems in the world. You have some of the most incredible extent of debt due to health expenditure, bankruptcies due to health expenditure. The Public Health Foundation of India showed us that in this decade that we still are in a single year, 55 million Indians fell below the poverty line due to debt. Okay. Now, all this, you can look at sector after sector and we could be here all night. But all this flows out of a framework of economic policy which didn't just allow for inequality, it celebrated inequality in the name of competitiveness, in the name of, you know, efficiencies. Capitalist, those are capitalist efficiencies. Yeah. If thousands of people die, that doesn't. Now, what's happened is it's affecting people far beyond those who are meant to be affected. So now there are worries in the middle class, there are worries in the elite, in some of the elite, there are worries. But let's look at inequality globally before and under the pandemic. American billionaires have added several hundreds of billions of dollars since the pandemic began. They have added hundreds of billions of dollars in the first 3 weeks of the pandemic in the United States. US billionaires added $280 billion to their wealth, according to various American journals and channels. Do you know how much that $280 billion, to get a sense of what it is to make $280 billion in a couple of weeks, in 3 weeks actually? In 1990, when, the Reaganomics phase really took off, sorry, 1990, yeah, at that time, the total value of American billionaires, the total net worth, cumulative net worth of American billionaires was $240. Yeah? $240. $240 billion. And in the first 3 weeks of the pandemic, they add $280 billion. Then Mr. Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, of Amazon, he has made some $35 billion in the last few months. Okay. Please also know that Mr. Bezos is heading towards becoming the first dollar trillionaire in history. So he wasn't hurt by the pandemic, nor was Mr. Bill Gates, whose value has gone up. So those who were doing the super rich before the pandemic, they are now super duper rich. Nothing much affected them. By the way, in the time of the pandemic, Mukesh Ambani, India's richest man, the biggest Indian owner of media, Mr. Ambani went from being the 29th richest person in the world or something to the 5th richest person in the world, according to the Hurun Billionaires report. I don't know what Forbes ranks him as now, but he went up several notches in the world's richest people. He now is at least, by consensus, the 5th richest person in the world. So when people keep talking, here's the thing, guys. Um, Even before the pandemic, the state of labor was terrible. The state of exploitation in caste was terrible. The state of exploitation in gender was terrible. It's going to be much worse. To give you a sense of inequality and gender inequality, do you know that women and girls, pre-pandemic, a January figure from Oxfam interpreting the data of Credit Suisse, interpreting the data of the United Nations, of ILO, women and girls in the pre-pandemic world provide 12 and a half billion hours. How many? 12 and a half billion hours of unpaid work daily. It doesn't figure in your GDP. So GDP growth figures don't in any way reflect the state of well-being of women, especially of poor women, because their work is unpaid and it doesn't get factored into the GDP, right? 12.5 billion. Um, if we compute that work of 12.5 billion hours, let's say it was paid at let's say it was paid at minimum wage everywhere. Oxfam estimated that that value is about 10.8 trillion dollars, which is more than three times the combined. That's more than three times the size of the top IT giants of the world. Yeah, of the top information tech giants of the world. So you're looking at that kind of inequality pre-pandemic. Imagine what's happened with the pandemic. If the US and Mr. Mukesh Ambani's example are any guide to what's going on. In India, in 1991, when the neoliberal economic reforms began, we did not have a single dollar billionaire. By 2012, by 2012, we had, sorry, by 2008, we had $12 billionaires, still modest. By 2012-13, we had $53 billion billionaires. Now, look, I choose 2012-13 as a point because it's also the year in which you conducted your socio-economic caste census. What did that show us? It showed us that 75% of rural families in India, how many rural households are there? 179 million, almost 18 crore. 75% of those households, the main breadwinner was taking home less than 5,000 rupees, or 5,000 rupees or less. If you made the benchmark 10,000, it was 90% of all rural households, main breadwinner was taking home 10,000 or less. Just 8%, just 8% had breadwinners taking home more than 10, main breadwinners taking home more than 10,000 a month. And of that 8%, if you just segregated Dalit and Adivasi households, it wasn't 8%, it was less than half of that. Less than half of that. And most of those Dalit and Adivasis who had fell in that 4% category would obviously have been in government service. Yeah. Teachers, PWD, sanitation, wherever, but they were working in government services for them to get that status where the main breadwinner had more than 10,000. But 2012-13, you had $53 billionaires. 2018, guys, you had $121 billionaires, and your $121 billionaires, the source is Forbes, by the way, the Oracle of Delphi for billionaires. The Forbes magazine calculated that your $121 billionaires held a wealth equivalent to 22% of your gross domestic product, giving a whole new meaning to the word gross, or giving it that whole other meaning. 22% of GDP, wealth, equivalent to 121 individuals in a population of 1.3 billion. You can, I'm not going to try the math. I think you need a super calculator for it. Okay? Tell you how tiny the focus that is. The Credit Suisse data show us that the top 1% in India is consolidating more and more in terms of a share of total household wealth. Right? So you have that as well happening. With all these inequalities, neoliberalism, what it did, it introduced and unleashed new inequalities while entrenching existing ones like caste, gender, class. Where are we headed? Consider just now what kind of, by the way, the 2021 census is going to be a mess. I don't even know if they will really try and conduct it just now. They might postpone. I don't know what they'll do, but the figures will be a mess, obviously, because of such large scale human movement. Now, what do we guys do? What do all of us do? I can see that you already have some questions up here, but in short, let me pull it together here for you. The pandemic COVID-19 has given us an incredible textbook of capitalism. It's given us an unbelievable autopsy of neoliberal capitalism. It ha- and the media, the governments are discussing unlock, lock, lockdown 5.0, unlock 2.0. The whole the whole thing is focused on how soon can we return to normal. I beg to state that I don't want to return to normal because for more than a billion human beings in this planet, the problem is not returning to normal. The normal was the problem. For your Dalit manual scavenger, sanitation worker, for your woman agricultural laborer, what was normal for them? For the landless, for the Adivasi being thrown off her land, what was normal for her? For the more than 1 billion people in the planet in acute hunger, what was normal for them? Do you want to go back to that normal? It's what they're pushing us back to. So they use terms like the new normal, some of them more cleverly. The new normal is the old normal on steroids. There's no going back to that corpse. What you can do is to end up producing more corpses. You have to go somewhere entirely differently. What are those things that you can do? I'll answer, I'll try, you can give me those specific questions, but broadly, I believe the questions are not anymore about what to do, but how to do. How do we organize in the time of the pandemic? And I'm telling you that people are showing us themselves, despite COVID-19, despite the pandemic, tens of thousands of farmers across the country, tens of thousands in Maharashtra, lakhs across the country, have come out and protested anyway. Yeah. And we need to understand newer and newer ways of fighting back the onslaught of neoliberalism in its death throes while it's seeking rigor mortis. Okay? There are the gigantic fights will be the fight to end inequality, the fight to break corporate power, the fight to end monopolies, yeah, the fight to assert rights and justice. And here is a framework that I'm giving you. I'm telling you the old frameworks, inclusive development, best practices, take them, put them in the dustbin. The frameworks of all struggles here on has got to be the framework of justice, the framework of rights. You have the basis in both the Indian Constitution and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. You know, when everyone talks about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, they talk about Article 19, right to freedom of expression, conscience, blah, blah. The Declaration of Human Rights had another set of invisible clauses, 23 to 28. The right to organize trade unions, the right to strike. Please, tonight, read the Declaration of Human Rights, to which India claims to be one of the authors inspirers, if not authors. It was authored by John Humphrey and Eleanor Roosevelt's guidance, or all sorts of stuff we don't know. But we do know that Indians played a role in the formulation of the UNDHR. 23 to 28, right to organize trade unions, right to uh, strike, right to a decent family wage, right to decent working hours. All these are our rights, and many of these reappear in your constitution in the directive principles of state policy. I think that it is going to be much, much more um, effective to mobilize people around a defense of their constitution, especially a defense of the directive principles, which are the outcome of India's freedom struggle, her struggle for independence and freedom from British imperialism, indeed, from all imperialism. Those, those positions go against all imperialism. I think that that's the starting point, the starting ground. The right to work. And oh, incidentally, the directive principles of state policy begin begin by telling you that it should be the aim of this nation to mitigate and end inequality. It's not an accident that your preamble says justice, social, economic, and political. It is not even an accident that social comes before economic and political. Think about it. In the immediate run, on agriculture, for instance, I'm saying that we need to have to fight for and get the government to declare a national health system with a fixed percentage of plan expenditure and budget expenditures on, on that health system. We need to make health for all, which was to have come by year 2000, a reality. We need to fight for what SFI has stood for decades, that right to free and compulsory education up to the secondary level and maybe even beyond. We should fight for it, which was promised to be implemented within 10 years of adoption of the Constitution of India. And the Gandhian plan of 1946, headed by Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, became your second president, who said a minimum of 10% of expenditure, not 10%, a minimum of 10% expenditure on education. You have the precedents, you have that. These are things we need to fight for. We need to fight for a complete removal of this rubbish of Aadhaar and biometrics, and food grain to be distributed absolutely across the spectrum for all hungry people. It's tragic that it needs a pandemic to make us look at hunger. But at least more people than before are beginning to understand that the extent of hunger that existed was far more than they earlier realized. So you can do that. At every stage, fight in the framework of justice. There are many fine examples of that framework and popular movements in this country. There is one great example in agriculture, the Kudumbashree movement in Kerala. Its framework is justice. It does not speak of food. It feels food sovereignty, food security are very limited concepts, and I totally agree. It goes beyond them to the issue of food justice. The producer shall never go hungry. No one should. So there are, you know, I don't think we have a right to ask ourselves, what should we do? There's plenty before us to do. I think we should ask ourselves, where should we begin? What should be step one? Yeah. Thank you. You can, I mean, can we get into the questions?
Yes, sir. Sir, thank you so much, sir, for this session. There are a few questions that um, we should address. Okay, so may I, sir?
Yeah, ask me the questions and I'll read
Yes,
out
sir.
the question.
The first question is, how would a structural change of our economy to solve these issues look like?
Any structural change involving your economy would have to be a frontal attack on the sources of inequality. It would mean a complete alteration of the ownership and redistribution of resources. It would mean that in agriculture, it would mean land reform. It would mean an entirely different pattern of ownership in many things. Maybe not always the same ways as attempted earlier, but it would mean that no that there are sectors where you would keep the private sector out or the corporate sector entirely out, including it would say health, food, hunger, education. I think these are sectors where the private sector has got to be driven out or minimized. And just for your information on the education sector, Sri Lanka, that has far better indicators than us in literacy and education, did not have a private sector in education of any significance till till the 90s or so. But they were always ahead of us. They had a state schooling system. Okay? So we need to break that. We need to break, uh, we need to prevent predatory commercialization of the social sectors. We need to completely break with that. We need entirely a system of distribution of resources, including progressive taxation, wealth, or many other things. We need to break the handing over. We need an end to the privatization liberalization process. We need a reversal of what's been happening in the name of public and private ownership, partnership, sorry, where essentially it means public property, private profit, where it means um, privatization of profits and socialization of losses. These sort of things have got to change completely. You simply have, and that structural change would mean also exactly those principles of, say, right to work, when every Indian has an enforceable right to work and decided on minimum wages, you cannot have the levels of inequality that you do now. You cannot have that. But also, your structural and economic onslaught on inequality will be very limited if it restricts itself purely to economic inequality. If it does not address much more seriously than we have ever addressed uh, caste inequalities, gender inequalities, and now the other area where we have to speak of justice is climate justice. It's a problem to me, it's a frustration with me that progressives in India have simply not really identified with and studied or worked on or propounded on the climate change issue. It's an extremely serious thing. It's already devastating Indian agriculture. In 20 years or less, that effect is going to be dramatic, so visible. It'll be like a COVID 19 autopsy. It's already pretty bad, but we are able not to look at it so far. So there's a whole bunch of things that we've got to be looking at, new issues as well, like climate change, that also play into inequality in very significant ways, which we can discuss if you like. But the structural change has to be also structures not just in the economy, but in society and politics as well. That kind of change you need. And there are initial steps that you take towards them. And that's what I was suggesting in the end of my talk. Thanks.
So we'll move to the next question.
Yeah.
How can the agricultural sector be revived with securing income for the family for the farming families even before COVID-19? They never got the price they deserved and now they are in disastrous situation.
The agriculture sector entered, you know, entered crisis from when we began what we wrongly call the new economic policies. It's more than a quarter of a century old now. Okay? We smashed, we smashed the livelihoods of tens of millions of Indians, not just the farmer, but all allied occupations. By the way, a lot of progressives themselves don't seem to be aware that the greatest sector of employment after agriculture is not IT or BT or whatever. Handlooms and handicrafts are the second biggest employer in this country. And by the way, as climate change issues are going to have an impact on what happens with industry, machinery, machine made products, the energies that are used in those, the world will be forced to reassess the value of handcrafted work. India, by the way, is the biggest producer of handloom fabric. Yeah. And your weavers commit suicides in significant number because we destroyed them. All these were tied together to with agriculture at the center. The You're quite right. They never got the prices they deserve because it was never intended that they should. The aim of neoliberal economic policy in India is to get people off agriculture and replace everything, place farming under corporate control. Here's why do I say corporate control, not private. Farming was and is a private sector. It is the biggest private sector in India. Right? Farming was not run by the state government or the central government or any, it wasn't run by the states or central government, but by millions of individuals, families, communities, groups. So, in fact, neoliberalism didn't just kill the public sector, it killed the private sector in the tiny private sector, the petty producers, to favor the corporate sector. The agrarian crisis, in 5 words: corporate hijack of Indian agriculture. The process by which that is achieved, in 5 words: predatory commercialization of our countryside. The outcome of that process, in 5 words: greatest displacement in our history. Okay? So it was never intended that farmers should get the prize. To win elections, the Congress, the UPA, the BJP, well, they stood up and lied. The present government came to power in 2014 on the promise of implementing the MS Swaminathan Committee, with more correctly, the National Commission of Farmers, chaired by Dr. MS Swaminathan. They came to power on the promise of implementing, particularly the recommendation cost of product COP2, cost of production 2, plus 50%. Plus 50%. The BJP in its 2014 election campaign, that was in many ways a central plank of the campaign in the countryside. And they said, within 1 month of coming to power, we will declare this, and within 12 months, we will do it. Within a month of their coming to power, they forswore that promise. Within a year, they filed an affidavit in the Supreme Court saying this cannot be done. It would distort market prices. It's okay if it distorts the lives and livelihoods of 100 million Indians, but it should not distort market prices. The market is sacred. So here was a ruling elite that all along knowingly lied, promised people what it knew it had no intention of giving them, and came to power using that, and ever since then blasted the hell out of that promise and have clearly said we cannot. There were also promises of cancellation of debt, never happened. Oh, another demand in the current thing, in setting things right, I think we need a global and national cancellation of debt of poor people, regardless of whether they're farmers or not. You got to do it. There are countries and societies in the world considering very, very large cancellation of debt within their own societies, within their own communities. I'm saying that for the world to come out of the pandemic, the debt of the third world countries has got to be completely wiped out. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to come out of it. So the agriculture thing, every successive regime from the Narasimha Rao government down to Mr. Modi's government lied. They told us that this is what we will do, and on coming to power told us we can't do that. That's not possible. You can't do that. They've got away with it. Right? So you've got to be able, what did I say? People are showing us already how to fight. In 2018, an organization formed, yeah, after a historic march of Adivasi farmers from Nashik to Mumbai, led by the All India Kisan Sabha. 40,000 people marched 182 kilometers in 6 days, yeah, to fight for those demands. Among those, the implementation of the Swaminathan Commission recommendation. It was mobilizing farmers everywhere, though those were not the only recommendations. Anyway, in sympathy with these marches, in which many of us participated, came up a platform called Nation for Farmers, a non-farmer organization of people like you, and many SFI members in Delhi and elsewhere are part of Students for Farmers. They formed their own organizations. And all of these groups formed the Nation for Farmers. You can find on the website dillichalo.in the parcha of the Nation for Farmers. What were its demands? Its main demand was minimum 3-week parliament session. Now I'm saying 3 weeks means nothing. An entire session of parliament to discuss and debate the agrarian crisis and related issues, because the crisis has gone beyond the agrarian. It is a societal crisis. It is a civilizational crisis with the largest body of smallholder farmers in the world struggling for survival. It's a struggle about our own loss of humanity, that we could sit by as a society and a nation and watch 330,000 farmers commit suicide, at least, and it has not moved us to massive action. But from 2018, the farmers and farm laborers have been showing us that mass action, meeting up in Delhi from 21 states, farmers showed up in November 2018. Mass struggles are ultimately inevitable and indeed very desirable. So you need that. I'm saying, we need to fight for that demand for a full session of parliament to discuss agrarian and related issues, including passing laws on ownership of natural resources like water, making sure there is a law that forbidding forever the privatization of water, which is already the biggest issue in the countryside, forbidding the privatization of public sector institutions like the public sector banks. None of this is going to happen unless we are able to spotlight and highlight it in the legislature. And while fighting for that in the legislature, by the way, I think we need to have the largest mobilization ever of farmers and laborers in history to be sitting outside parliament during that session. And I think in that session, we ought to introduce the practice of public hearings in parliament, a Jan Sunwai inside parliament, where victims of the agrarian crisis address the nation as a whole about why they think they are where they are. I think that that is a very important demand to fight towards. And all these other demands should be coming up, fought for, and achieved in that session, by which time you will have raised a national level of consciousness about this problem. For a start, Swaminathan Commission and its reforms and what it suggested, but also many other issues. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come to the last question, sir. Last question. Yeah. Is it safe to say that the recent fall in our GDP growth rate can be attributed to capitalism's inadequacy to fight corona rather than corona itself?
Sorry, can be attributed to?
Can be attributed to capitalism's inadequacy to fight corona rather than corona itself.
Well, corona itself can be attributed to capitalism. What you're witnessing is, since late 90s, is the globalization of communicable disease, the SARS strain. Corona is also a SARS virus. Its official name is SARS-CoV-2. COVID-19, but actually SARS-CoV-2, in 2 in Roman. I'm saying that corona has accelerated your GDP and other problems, but the devastation of your GDP was achieved by human agency first. Corona comes along, lockdown comes along, and obviously exacerbates that problem. But remember that your two things. One is the decline in GDP was already happening. It became visible. It became visible after demonetization. A lot of I mean, several progressive economists had been arguing that you're going to be in very serious trouble after the demonetization. Second, even the quarter before the pandemic, there was a constant slowing of growth in the quarters before the pandemic as well. And people were noticing this and they were arguing. But here's the thing, this arguing over the growth numbers, it's a peculiarly uh, neoliberal pastime with very little connection to the real world of ordinary people. Why numbers can be why numbers of GDP may not be the best reflection. However, that contraction is going to hurt you. The way your world is structured, gains in the GDP will primarily be accrued to the rich and the elite. Losses and decline will be primarily borne by the masses. So, yes, the answer to your question is yes, it's built into capitalism. It's built into a very rapidly developing neoliberal capitalism and neoliberal globalization. And Corona did not invite, and as I said it at the very beginning, Corona did not create your economic crisis, but it actually exacerbated it. Whether it's the issue of GDP or growth numbers or anything, Corona is showing you an autopsy of that corpse.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It was a very, very insightful and captivating session. And I think in this time of pandemic, what you said is very, very important, and we should all remember this, that we don't want to go back to the normal, as the normal itself was a problem for all minority people. And you beautifully described the new normal to be the old normal on steroids. And thank you, sir. Thank you for your words. I'm sure your powerful words will motivate all of us to think and think further.
I, can I forgot, there was one thing that I forgot to appeal to all of you.
Yes, sir.
Please, there is something that, as I told you about the People's Archive of Rural India, which publishes in Bengali as well. I need you to see that. You'll see millions of stories on livelihoods. But in August, in the month of August, we introduced a special section for students. It's called Pari Education. It's for students, teachers, and researchers. You can participate in that section. You can write about what's happening in the countryside, provided you make a visit there. Maybe in the villages or amongst rural migrants in Kolkata or Jadavpur, wherever. But I invite all of you to participate in it, and you'll find various age groups from 11 upwards participating in it, but especially college and university students are participating in Pari education. Please do have a look at it. Ah, it's also our answer to corporate online education that we are trying to bring children, students, a different kind of education, absolutely free, no access charge. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, no, sir. Absolutely, sir. We surely will. We surely will, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for being here. And we hope to have you with us in future as well, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.